Welcome to the Sharp Angles Betting and DFS Show. My name is Tod Burros, and I am your host. And I am joined once again by my partner, Ryan McCrystal. And we will first go over the Thursday night game, then hit Ryan's props for the rest of the week, and then get some of my early thoughts on the DFS slate that is to be. But before we dive into today's episode, we want to remind you that you can get access to all our fantasy content, including insights, props, worksheets, and more by taking advantage of our fantasy packages available on the Sharp Football website. Right now, we're running a special offer for listeners, code ANGLES, for 25% off any fantasy package. 25% discount also extends to every package site-wide. Hence, it's available on everything. Check it out in the podcast description or use the code ANGLES during checkout on the purchase page of the Sharp Football website. Also, if you could please subscribe and give thumbs up on our YouTube channel, we are hunting for subs. That's right, folks. We are hunting for subs. Preferably with turkey and Swiss, little bit of that, oil and vinegar that they put. Oh, I'm sorry. I've digressed. Also, you can like and follow us on wherever you listen to podcasts. And with that bad joke and dad humor behind us, it is now time to bring in one Ryan McCrystal. Ryan, buddy, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Todd. How you doing?
Obviously, I'm a maniac, but other than that, we're going to do the best we can. Why don't you tell us about how your stuff did last week?
We had a bit of a down week last week. We were 2-3. I believe we gave out 6 props on the podcast. We were 2-3 on the ones we played. That Wan'Dale Robinson prop that we talked about. I remember the week before I was saying how that line was just crazy, so high it almost looked like a typo. And then his longest reception prop ended up falling by 4 or 5 yards, which we almost never see. So unfortunately, the odds makers caught on to that mistake, and that ended up not.
It became one don't.
Yeah. Yep. It did.
All right. With that in mind, we move on to this week. Where, I will say that I also threw out a prop on the Thursday night game. I felt really good about the Kansas City kicker getting more than 3 extra points against the awful Denver defense, and I was sorely disappointed as he, instead of hitting 3 extra points, hit about a gazillion field goals. Ryan, what is your Thursday night prop for this week?
Yeah, so in this Jaguars Saints game, I'm going to take the over on Travis Etienne's rush attempts. It's set to 16.5. I'll be on the over. A couple pretty simple explanations for this. First of all, track record. He's hit the over. He's gone over that number in all but one game so far this year, and the one under was against the Chiefs. And that makes sense. Although it was a low-scoring game, surprisingly, when you're going into the Chiefs, you got to assume you got to throw. So you're not going to enter that game with a run-heavy game plan as much as you would think. This game against the Saints, the total's really low. You would think that they would lean on the run game a little bit more. And although I will say another factor here is that the Saints and Jaguars rank 3rd and 4th in plays per game. So I do think this has the potential to be a bit of a faster-paced game than we might think. The total's set to 41 right now. I believe that's actually climbed a little bit today. So not expecting a ton of points, but both of these teams, they play at a decent pace. We'll see enough plays in this game. I think Etienne hits the over. And then the other factor, he just dominates the backfield touches. Tank Bigsby is not a factor. D'Ernest Johnson is not a factor. He gets 82% of the running back carries in this backfield. That's the 3rd highest rate of any ball carrier in the league. So, unless...
And one of my biggest misses, and I made a post because I watched Tank Bigsby's tape, and it was just okay to me, right? I didn't see a special player, and I didn't see someone who was terrible. I saw someone who was in the middle. And all the hype started, and I started drafting him 15th, 16th round, when I got bored of drafting Tajay Spears. And what ended up happening was he he got up into the 11th, 12th round where I stopped. And I made a tweet this week that I really kick myself when I do stuff like this and I don't trust my own evaluations, right? I had him as an average at best talent. And if that's the case, well, that means Travis Etienne, on the fear that Bigsby would be something, late fourth, early fifth. I took some, but definitely not enough, Ryan. It's always best ball time when you talk to me.
Of course.
Let's get back to you and your more current take on Travis Etienne.
Yeah, I mean, we pretty much covered all of it. Those are my three reasons. The strong track record, he dominates touches, and the chance that this is a higher scoring or at least faster paced game than I think some people are thinking. I think he should easily clear that 16.5 rush attempts.
Yeah, and I am going to have two this week, Ryan, on Thursday night. Both have to do with one Alvin Kamara. I am going to go over his 48.5 rushing yards and over his 30.5 receiving yards. I figure at the very least I should get one of them, right? If he's not doing one, he does the other. If you wanted to, and this is on Underdog, because if you wanted, I'm still learning on props, and I just feel like right now they need Kamara, and Kamara looks like the Alvin Kamara of old. It only takes one big play between the running and the passing for me to break even. And if I get a little help, I think he can get both. If you took the rushing and receiving prop together and you added the rushing and receiving yards, there's a 4.5 yard either way, yard difference. And I was wondering, is that normal? Because to me, it kind of was a signal that the individual ones, which I already liked, were a good play.
Yeah, I would say I don't play that prop very often, so I can't say how often you're going to see a big difference there. But I will say it's not common for numbers to be slightly different on these different types of props that are available. They almost never match up. Similar to when you play single game parlays, although the numbers are often similar or the same in the single games parlays, the juice might be a little bit different. I feels like the books will try to nickel and dime you a little bit in those areas, and they'll find ways to make it a little bit more difficult. And that's essentially what it is you're basically playing, a single game parlay if you're betting for his rushing and receiving yards total. It's very similar to that. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that there's a slight difference there. It's not uncommon to see discrepancies as you're looking around even within the same space.
What do you think of my over on Kamara?
I would say I think both of those lines are priced pretty fairly. I would probably lean towards agreeing with you though, because as I said, both of these teams have tended to play fast, run a lot of plays in the game. It definitely bodes well. That would bode well for him to have, a big splash play, and you get like a 20-yard run or a 20-yard catch at some point, and you're in really good shape.
Yeah. So another kind of, I think I've talked about how I look for hidden advantages, right? And I feel like one of the hidden advantages is that Trevor Lawrence is playing through an injury. And if that's the case, it's very likely they don't have the ball as much and play as well as they normally do, which pushes the volume over to the other side. So that was my thought process there. That was part of it, Ryan. All right, let's move on to your Sunday props or Monday props, as the case may be. Patrick Mahomes' longest completion, under or over, Ryan?
I'm going to be on the over. This one is available at 37.5 yards, and I'm excited about that. I was willing to play it up to 39.5. And the reason for that is the Chargers have allowed a completion of 40 yards or longer in all but one game. The only quarterback who didn't reach 40 yards against them was Aiden O'Connell in his first career start. So obviously not surprising there that he would be the one to stand out. So, a playmaker like Mahomes against a defense that's been exposed, this is a great matchup for this prop. And just to sort of underscore just how bad the Chargers secondary has been, looking just sort of big picture, we tend to see more big plays happen against single high coverage. You're more likely to have a one-on-one matchup. A receiver gets loose down the field. There's no help over the top. You get a big play. Against single high coverage, 4.1% of those plays produce a 30-yard catch or longer. Against two high coverage, where you have more help over the top, only 3.1% of the plays. Well, to drive home the point of how bad the Chargers have been, they use two high coverage at one of the highest rates in the league. So they should be limiting big plays. Over 55% of their snaps using two high coverage, but 5.6% of passes against them have gone for 30 or more yards. So they're allowing these big plays at a rate even higher than you would expect if they were exclusively playing single high coverage. So they've been terrible. And Mahomes, this hasn't been the most explosive Chiefs offense. He's only had 2 plays of 40 or more yards, but it doesn't really concern me because it's Mahomes, right? Like, we know he's capable of explosive plays. I think Mahomes against a bad defense, it doesn't really matter if he doesn't have great weapons this year. He's going to be capable of beating a bad defense, I think.
Yep. I was too high, but it was the 70s. And, what happened in the 70s stays in the 70s. So we'll move on. Jonathan Taylor, longest rush, over or under?
So I'm actually going to be on his rushing yards under here against the Browns. Has a lot to do with the matchup. This line is available at 44.5. I'll be on the under, as I said. His usage is rising. So this number has climbed each week as far as what it's available. He played 15% of the snaps in his first game, 42% last week. I think we should assume that he's going to further cut into Zach Moss's workload in this game, probably get closer to a normal workload for him. But this is just a brutal matchup against the Browns defense. The under for starting running backs rushing yards against the Browns is 4-1 so far. Gus Edwards, surprisingly, was the one guy who managed to hit the over. The Browns, they just give you absolutely no room to run. This is just a suffocating run defense. They're contacting running backs in the backfield on 54% of carries this year. Now, listen to this. Their season average, 54% contact rate in the backfield. There are only 2 other teams this year that have contacted running backs in the backfield at a rate of 54% or higher in a single game. The Browns are on a whole other planet when it comes to their run defense. If they were to sustain this for a full season, which they probably won't, it'll drop off a little bit. But if they would, they would be in the conversation of greatest run defense of all time. I mean, we don't see this.
Which was just for clarity, the Ravens team that won the title in 2000. I believe there might have been one other team close, but I think they held teams to 2.8 yards per carry. And I don't think I've ever seen under 3 other than that.
And think about it. That's a completely different era too, where you kind of you knew teams were going to run. The game was much more, it's all centered in the middle of the field. A lot more 2 tight end run plays and whatnot. It's easier to create space to run. It's much harder for the defense to get you in the backfield, and the Browns are doing it at an insane rate. And just to drive home that point even more, the league average for backfield contact rate is 26%, and the Browns are more than double that. And they've already played the Titans and 49ers. So you can't even look to their schedule and say, well, it's going to fall off at some point. I mean, we kind of know it will fall off because sustaining it for a full season with injuries and whatnot, it's not going to happen. But this isn't the case of a tough schedule. I mean, the Titans, obviously, Derrick Henry, they're not as good as past years this year, but still a very capable run game. Same thing with the 49ers. For them to be shutting these teams down at this rate, there's just no reason to think an offense like the Colts is going to be able to run on them. So I think for Taylor to hit the over, it would have to be the Colts defense would have to shut down the Browns in order to make this a very low scoring close game so that the run game is still in play for the Colts. And then he would just need a crazy volume because the odds of him breaking off a long run against this team as well is not very high. So at 44.5 yards, I like this as well. I was hoping the Zach Moss line would still be higher. Both of them were lined over 40 yards last week, but the Moss dropped to 33 yards in his line. So I'll stay away from that because I think it's still plausible that he clears that if he sees a surprisingly high workload. We still don't know exactly what the split is going to be between those guys. So I'll go with just Taylor, but I feel pretty good about the under in this one.
Well, the name Josh Downs would make you think that you were on the under, but history on this show uh, says that you're probably on the over. Where are you on receptions with Josh Downs this week, Ryan?
Yeah, sticking with this same game, and despite the Browns' defense being great, I'm going to be on the over for Josh Downs receptions. We played this last week and won, and if you listened last week, our reasoning was really based on his connection with Gardner Minshew. It seems like he's a much better fit for what the offense is when Minshew is out there. He sees a 21% target share from Minshew, 16% from Richardson. I think I forgot to mention what this line is. It's not available yet, but I'd be willing to take the over up to 4.5 on Downs receptions. The reason why we're seeing a difference here between Minshew and Richardson seems to be the fact that Downs is a much bigger factor in the quick passing game. And Richardson, like basically all mobile quarterbacks, much more likely to hold the ball longer. And that's not really, Downs is not going to be his target. Much more likely to want to try to find Pittman down the field, right? If he's holding the ball for a long time and scrambling around. Whereas Downs in the slot, he's great for the quick passing game. And so from both quarterbacks on throws released in 2.5 seconds or less, Downs sees a 21% target share compared to 15% on plays that take longer than that. And Minshew is obviously just getting the ball out a lot faster. I think this is actually a particularly good matchup for him, even though the Browns defense is very good. I think that benefits Downs because he sees so many quick targets, because the Browns generate pressure in 2.5 seconds or less on 37% of snaps. That's the highest rate in the league. So if you're going up against a defense that's going to generate a lot of quick pressure, you're going to have to get the ball out really quickly. So I think we should see Downs peppered with targets in the slot in this matchup. So I'll take the over at 4.5 for his receptions.
Downs, one of my most owned players in best ball. I think I might have mentioned this at least once, that I had him as discount Zay Flowers. Coming out of the draft, I felt that they did a lot of the same things, but you could get down 6, 7, 8 rounds later. Kenneth Walker, Texas Ranger? No. Kenneth Walker, Seattle running back, longest rush, over.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards the over. Unfortunately, this line has now been posted and it's higher than I was expected, at least where I saw it at things. I was going to say bet it up to 16.5. It actually climbed even higher than that. It's available at 17.5. I'll still talk about it though, because obviously they're slightly different. These lines can differ by a yard or two at different books. So definitely look around. I'd prefer to take it at 16.5. It's at 17. It sort of falls into a category of, I would play it if I were looking for action on that game. But if you're not sitting there watching Seahawks Cardinals,
if you're at a bar and it's 2 a.m. and there's no other bets.
Exactly. So that falls into that category for me, is one that I'd be willing to play, but it's not going to be on my list of priorities if it's only available at 17.5. But anyways, we're playing this because of the Cardinals defense. Normally, I'm not interested in the Kenneth Walker longest rush at all, although he has hit the over 3 weeks in a row. Reason I'm not super interested in it is he's one of these running backs that dances in the backfield a lot. He invites a lot of early contact, rates in the bottom half of the league in getting hit behind the line of scrimmage, but he gets the Cardinals this week and their defense is helpless. Basically, the Cardinals generate contact in the backfield on just 15% of rush attempts. So even with Walker's tendency to dance a little bit, he's not going to run into a ton of early contact against the Cardinals. And when he avoids that early contact, he is a fairly explosive running back. He reaches 15 or more yards on 9% of his carries when he avoids backfield contact. That ranks in the upper half of the league. So he certainly has explosive ability against a really bad defense like the Cardinals. So this is a really good matchup for him. Like I said, shop around and hopefully we can find this line at 16.5. If it's at 17.5, I'm leaning towards staying away. But if you're looking for action on the game, I wouldn't blame you for playing it anyway.
Yep. So we will only count that next week if we find it at 16.5 or under. And speaking about under, your last prop of the week is Josh Allen rushing yards under.
Yeah, the under on Josh Allen's rushing yards against the Patriots. Haven't seen a line for this yet. I'll take the under at 21.5 or higher. The under has hit in 5 of his 6 games so far this year. They're really not using him in the run game a whole lot, and he's not scrambling much either. He's carried the ball more than 4 times in a game only once this year. And they've actually only called 2 designed runs for him all year, excluding quarterback sneaks. So they're not using him in these designed running games. And in this particular game where
Did we lose you?
sounds like your shoulder injury, it sounds sort of tell him we don't need you taking any hits. Do whatever you can to not run in this game. Don't take any hits. So they're probably not going to call designed runs for him. They're probably going to discourage him from scrambling. So we've kind of seen him trending in that direction all year. And in this game in particular, it doesn't seem like a good matchup for his run game. So at 21 yards or higher, I'll be on the under for Allen's rushing yards.
Awesome. All right. Luke Taddeo asked over what. Hopefully you did come back and answer.
Yeah, I think he was referring to Josh Downs. And I think I mentioned that.
Oh, gotcha.
Not available yet, but if we get that line at 4.5 receptions or lower, I'll be on the over.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that wraps up my props for the week. Let's dive into your DFS stuff, and as always, let's start out with your favorite quarterbacks for the week.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to be talking a lot more about situations and theory today because there's very, very few plays I like right now at ownership, almost across the board. So, like I was saying with quarterback, not a lot to love right now, but there are a few cheap guys I'll be monitoring ownership on. And remember my rule, I want to be able to take at least 2% and preferably at least 3% on low-owned, low-priced quarterbacks, because if the field is on them, unless there's some real compelling reason, it's hard to get to that 2 to 3 times. But I will throw out preseason darling Aiden O'Connor. He's at $4,800. It didn't work out great last time, but he really didn't kill you either at that salary. And with an angry Devontae Adams, they're incorporating Mayer more, and they're playing a team that's not very good. I'm going to throw out Aiden O'Connor, and it looks Jimmy G was ruled out. So now, if O'Connor, much like Ryan's props, if you start seeing O'Connor at 10%, that's really tough. I don't know that I want 20% Aiden O'Connor, but there's a lot of really meh plays. You'll notice all the expensive guys are rating not very good. The only one and they still have ownership. So high salaried players to match them with, none of them really rating very well. That's not something that I want to be overweight on. So I really need to monitor ownership a lot this week. Justin Herbert doesn't have any ownership right now. And I think there's some really decent bringbacks from the Chiefs. I think most people who do go to that game will go with Patrick Mahomes. But Mahomes, if Kelsey doesn't go nuts, Mahomes will spread it around for 3-4 guys at times, where that Herbert's likely to go through Keenan Allen first, and then Palmer and Eckler. I think either one of those two to go with that stack, if you can afford it, is good. I like Jordan Love, but he's 10% ownership. I want to see that come down to like 5 or 6%, 5,800 against the Denver D. In the old days of DFS, after a quarterback crapped the bed while on national TV, his ownership would come in lower than expected. Hopefully that continues, as 10% is really borderline for me on Jordan Love, even though Christian Watson's ownership is pretty low, and I'll mention him in the wide receiver area. 3 other guys I will mention. Jared Goff at 6,400 has 1% ownership. I don't like him there at 6,400, playing Baltimore on the road. I mean, home road splits are a real thing with Jared Goff. That being said, if he's going to be less than 1% owned, Baltimore is more of a pass funnel than a run funnel. So I will at least throw him out there. And the last two, Daniel Jones and Sam Howell. If Daniel Jones plays, I think Jalen Hyatt is interesting. They haven't had the opportunity to throw the ball downfield. Their offensive line's a wreck. I want both these guys to be at about 5%. They're both at 7%, but I wouldn't be shocked if the millionaire maker lineup has one of those two quarterbacks this week. Ryan, it's ugly at quarterback for sure.
Yeah, I like a few of the names you mentioned, though. I'm a sucker for rookies with all the draft coverage that I do. So I'm intrigued by Aiden O'Connell as well. In my scouting report on him, I mentioned that if there's a Brock Purdy in this class, I think it's O'Connell. Now, that's a big if because most classes don't have anybody emerge from the later rounds of the draft. But O'Connell, he's accurate at all levels of the field. That's his strength. And he landed with Josh McDaniels, and that's what you need to excel in a Josh McDaniels offense. So he landed in a good spot for him. So if he feels a little bit more comfortable in this game against a bad defense, yeah, I think he could surprise us and have a pretty good game. So I think there's it's certainly worth taking a shot at him. The other one that seems obvious to me is Jared Goff, given his low roster share. That absolutely makes sense. The Ravens defense, do we know if they're any good? They ranked 4th in scoring D. They ranked 2nd in total D. But you got to go back when is this early in the season? You got to look at who they've played, and the list of quarterbacks they've played. It's pretty brutal. They played C.J. Stroud in his NFL debut, and he actually had a pretty good game against them.
Yeah,
and they played a broken Joe Burrow in week 2. Burrow, clearly those first couple of games of the season, that was not Joe Burrow. That was the shell of Joe Burrow. Then they played Gardner Minshew, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, Kenny Pickett, and then last week, Ryan Tannehill and Malik Willis got into the game. So they haven't played anybody to make us really believe that this is a defense that's going to now shut down a legitimately good offense from Detroit. So with Goff's roster share being down at like 1%, I think, is that what you said it was? 1%?
Yeah, right now it's showing at 1% or less.
To me, that seems like an obvious start. Like that should be your quarterback of the week.
Yeah, I mean, because 6,400 is more than you really want to spend on Jared Goff on the road. But the other thing is, Gibbs might play, but he's not a great runner between the tackles if he has a hamstring. Reynolds is now banged up. Monty is out. It is really, really possible, Ryan, that they have to throw the ball more, and that means more touchdowns. So, yeah, and anytime you can get Amon-Ra St. Brown on a roster with very low on Jared Goff, I'm going to be over on that, even if it's only 4 or 5% versus 1.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Good point about the running backs too. This could be a game where they're forced to throw a little bit more just because of what their backfield looks like. All right. So speaking of backfields, let's move on to running backs. I know you're not exactly crazy about your options at this position either this week.
Yeah. Right. I mean, right now the chalk is Isaiah Pacheco, Jacobs of the Raiders, Ford of the Browns, and Rachaad White. All of them right now are showing about 20% ownership. None of them rate well enough either. It's not like that they're getting ownership not because they rate that well, but because they rate slightly better than everyone else, right? Last week, we had some really good options that you could expect possibly 5x on. This week, depending on how the site you use for projections has them, I mean, they're barely all those guys are barely positive. And, when that's the case, when the chalk falls upon people, not because they're good, but because they're the best out there, I'm almost always going to look to find other things. The two that I would say is Jacobs. I mean, do I really want to play him against 23% ownership? No, but he's starting to come on. He certainly has the workload to justify it. And I think Isaiah Pacheco has really shown some juice. If I'm going to be even weight or overweight on any of those guys, I just think that the problem with Walker for me is he is scoring touchdowns at a regression-worthy rate. He is just getting 1 to 2 touchdowns every week. His points above, without touchdowns, he's a terrible value. You need touchdowns from him. And I played him last week when he was, lower owned, but I don't like playing guys like that into ownership. Another one I'm not crazy about right now, Zach Evans has a pretty high ownership for the Rams, but we've seen Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Sean McVay, running backs. If he doesn't trust you, the fact that everyone who went down in front of you doesn't mean he trusts you anymore. So I am not going to play Evans he was playing behind Ronnie Rivers 100%. If I said to you in January, February of last year, average listener, Ronnie Rivers, you would have said, huh?
Fresno State.
Few people. What's that?
Fresno State.
Fresno State. See, Ryan knows it. I barely knew it. And I knew he had a chance, but not best ball worthy chance. So, I think a lot of people are talking about Royce Freeman, but I'm going to play some Darrell Henderson if he's active at 4K. We've seen McVay a number of times go back to, what was his name? CJ Brown? Malcolm Brown.
Malcolm Brown, yeah.
Malcolm Brown. They would sign him off the street and he would get 15 carries when there was an injury. The fact that Henderson has experience with McVay, I would rather take shots there. Ryan does not like Jonathan Taylor. And you know what? For a bet, I think, again, we've talked about this, Ryan, a few times, the difference between a DFS and a bet and what you're hoping to accomplish. Jonathan Taylor at 6,500 has the ability to take a run to the house against anyone, right? Is he less likely to do it against Cleveland? Absolutely. But right now, he is, he's most likely going to be an $8,000 player by the end of the year with an ownership under 5%. If that holds, I will try and be over on Jonathan Taylor. And lastly, Austin Eckler doesn't rate very well, but it's his second week back. The KC game has the highest total on the week. I am seriously considering some Austin Eckler this week.
Yeah, well, I mentioned I like rookies, but I think I'm with you on Zach Evans. That's a risky play. He's like, the way I described him in my scouting report was that he's just sort of like an all or nothing. He'll just full speed ahead, whether there's a hole there or not. He's just going for it. And you can hit some home runs that way, especially when you're going up against college defenses. But those holes close pretty quickly, and they aren't always there in the NFL at the same rate as he was used to in that Mississippi offense, which also, we should also mention the offense he played in Mississippi. Lane Kiffin does a fantastic job of spreading teams out for the run game and creating a lot of light boxes. And so he's running in a very different environment that he's used to. And I think that's one of the reasons that, although just a crazy amount of talent, 5-star prospect as a recruit when he first went to TCU, he's incredibly talented. The excitement for him long-term is warranted. I think that's probably why he's struggling to adjust, because he doesn't seem to have great vision, and he was carrying the ball at Ole Miss in just a very different environment. So this is probably not a candidate for a breakout game yet at this point in his career.
A lot of people, during draft season, I saw on tape what you described. A guy who was fast if he got into the open field, but he was very straight ahead, almost no wiggle in his hips. That's not my kind of back. I think guys like that. I thought very similarly about McBride this year. Not a lot of wiggle. Zach Evans definitely has more juice than McBride. But I agree with that assessment completely. And that's why I'm going to look to, be over on, if there's 3 backs active and he's one of them, unless we hear he is the guy and he's going to get 20 carries. No.
All right, let's move on to the wide receivers. We definitely have some better options for us in this group.
Yep. I don't love the chalk. I won't bother mentioning who it is. You can all look it up. But I really love Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers at the Bears at current ownership. They're not rating all that well, but Adams has one of the biggest squeaky wheel narratives we've ever seen. Myers is great leverage if Adams fails. And, the Bears are a no bueno defense. And, if I get either of these guys 10% or under, which is about where they are right now, I mean, I could see myself making a rule of one of Adams, Myers, or Jacobs in every lineup, counting on the fact that one of them is quite likely to have a big game. All three of the Seahawks are interesting to me. The only one with any ownership is Tyler Lockett. The Arizona defense isn't good. I played a lot of JSN last week. People forget the little things. He's been playing hurt. He broke a bone right before the season. I think I mentioned him last week. He's only up to 3,900, and I would like to see less Bobo out there, but I still think JSN's a good play. And then I kind of like Kadarius Toney at no ownership in 3,800. I think the Chiefs are going to look at how not explosive they've been lately. And we've seen them at times run a lot of plays, especially for Toney, which is what he needs, to be frank. And I think that people who are going to play a wide receiver on that team are going to play Rashee Rice. And I think that's a good call too. And lastly, if I'm playing Love, Christian Watson at 10% ownership against Denver. I mean, Watson, he just doesn't seem to have that dog in him. He seems like a little bit of a snowflake, or like I like to call it, he's like an 80s Jaguar. Looks amazing, but anything that happens and he's in the shop for 3 weeks. So those are my wide receiver thoughts, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm with you on Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers. I mean, we already mentioned that I think Aiden O'Connell could potentially look better this time around, and that could be a surprise
against the Bears.
Yeah, especially given the matchup, that could be a surprisingly good offense this week.
I mean, this probably better than me. Do the Bears have any kind of pass rush? Because typically, what gets rookies is pressure. And if you blitz and you got a guy like Adams, you can hit either one of those guys with quick slants. Anyway, that's my thoughts on that one. What are your thoughts on my JSN play?
That's who I was going to mention next. I love it. He's got a breakout game coming sooner or later, given that skill set. I mean, he was by far wide receiver number one for me in this class. And he's got the type of skill set that you would expect him to have a decent rookie year because he's a good route runner. And that's usually the thing that holds receivers back a little bit if they have to, learn a more complete route tree. But Ohio State runs a fairly pro style offense, and he had experience in the slot and on the outside. So he's the type of player that you would think would assimilate to an NFL offense relatively quickly, especially when he's not the guy in the offense. He's got other guys to take attention away from him. So a breakout game is coming, and why not against the Cardinals? It certainly seems like this could potentially be the matchup. It could also be an opportunity where if they build a little bit of an early lead, maybe they feed him a few extra targets, try to run the offense through him a little bit, just to get him a little bit more experience, because obviously he hasn't played a huge role to this point in the season. The one that you mentioned that I will say I disagree with is Kadarius Toney. Just given his role in the offense, even if he needs a huge volume to produce from a fantasy perspective, the way that they use him. He's seen 42 targets since he got to Kansas City, and only 6 of them have been more than 10 yards downfield. So that type of receiver needs a huge volume. If he's seeing 5 or 6 targets a game, that's not enough, unless he
needs to break one.
Once or twice a year, maybe he breaks a 50-yard.
And we haven't seen that kind of uber, the way he would flash and, make 8 people miss. I mean, he needs that as well. I just think at 3,800 he's interesting, but I would have no problem if you decide to play Rashee Rice instead.
Yeah, definitely. It's just you need huge volume. You need 10 or 12 targets with that type of receiver who's just getting peppered on the underneath routes for consistent production at least. So if you're rostering him, just know that you could have a big game, but that big game is only going to come once or twice a year, most likely. So it's a long shot. Let's move on to tight ends.
The reason I mentioned it's the highest total game on the slate. Mm-hmm. The Chiefs have not looked like the Chiefs so far, right? I know that everyone can get well against the disastrous Charger defense, but it's just an interesting. If he's going to be less than 1 or 2% owned, I don't mind 8 to 10. But sorry to interrupt you there.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say, let's move on to the tight ends and wrap things up with this group.
Awesome. So for me, a couple things I noticed at tight end. There's 3 guys who are pretty chalky. 2 of them are Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews. So right now, 30% of the field is slated to play a very expensive tight end. And, when that's the case, I was big on Andrews last week. I just don't want to play him into ownership right now. And that also puts you into a certain build. So look for ways to turn that build on its head. And one of the ways is to play a cheap tight end who is going to get ownership is Musgrave. I mean, I feel like we've seen this movie before. Musgrave at high ownership, and it just didn't work out. So I'm not playing him into 20% ownership despite the matchup, despite anything. I will keep the Raiders thing going with Mayer at 2,700. I mean, that is really cheap. He finally got involved last week, and he looked like the guy who was most analysts' number 1 tight end coming out. And if the 3% sticks at that price, which I kind of doubt, I would love to pivot to him. Also, I mentioned that game stacking. So if you're not going to play one of the expensive tight ends and you don't like too many guys at tight end, always try and either take the tight end that's playing with your quarterback or against the quarterback. Since you only need a touchdown out of these low guys, don't take someone who's just terrible. Don't play Austin Hooper. But if you have somebody who is, pretty decent and you'd be considering, that's a good tiebreaker. And lastly, I'm going to throw Kyle Pitts out there. He looks like he's getting healthier. His salary's up to $4,000, but right now I'm seeing low ownership. And if low ownership, Kyle Pitts, still cheap price, he seems to be coming on. Ryan, that's one of my favorite plays on the board this week right now.
Yeah, I could see that. It certainly makes sense. He does seem to be trending in the right direction. I was looking a little bit deeper at the tight end position and just sort of how different guys have performed. It really feels like, maybe even more so than usual, if you're not spending up for the top end, you're really just chasing touchdowns. I went back and looked at the tight ends who've scored 13 or scored over 12 points without a touchdown this year. And you've got Kelce, Kittle, Waller, Ingram, Hockenson, Pitts, and then Jonnu Smith and Jake Ferguson. So other than those last 2, who each only did it once, if you're going to get a decent number there without a touchdown, you got to go for that top tier of guys. And other than that, you're just throwing darts and hoping for a touchdown, which is even riskier than usual this year because scoring has been down so much. So if you're chasing a touchdown with one of those lower salaried tight ends, that team's probably not scoring more than 2, maybe 3 touchdowns in the game. So the odds of him getting the end zone are pretty low because he's salaried down there because he's not a big part of the offense. So you'd need to study this more in depth to know if I'm really on the right track or not. I'm sort of just throwing a theory out, but I wonder if this year more than usual.
That's kind of what I was saying is if you're just going to take a low price guy, at least make him part of a game stack because you need to get less things correct, right? Because if that game goes off and if he gets the touchdown, you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes more sense. And if you're not doing that, my theory is basically that it seems like more so than usual, this might be a year to consistently spend up to that, that top tier of tight ends that at least they are consistently involved in the passing game.
And a guy I almost mentioned was Laporta. Certainly, if you're going to play Goff, he's right around the price of Mark Andrews. And right now, he's not showing ownership. And he's already shown 2 touchdown upside. So I think he is a very interesting play this week.
Yeah, I believe he's banged up, isn't he? He's been on the injury report.
That's
so
what's
keep
probably
an eye on
keeping
that.
ownership down.
Yeah, for sure.
But he played last week, and normally these guys, if they play 1 week and you don't hear them getting re-injured, they're normally a little bit better the second week. And he looked fine last week.
Yep.
All right, that's going to do it for this week. Ryan and I thank you for listening. We look forward to doing the show with you next week. Remember, if you want to get any Sharp package this week, it's 25% off. Use the code ANGLES at checkout. Help us out by subscribing and rating the podcast. Be a follower of the YouTube channel. We really would appreciate it. And we will see you next week.